Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing something different. We are going to be talking about the Fox sisters, and I personally believe that if you are a medium out there, if you are a psychic, we owe so much to the Fox sisters for doing what they did, carving the path that they did, and I think that their story is just absolutely fascinating. And every time that I see their story shared, I only see like snippets of it, never the full thing. And in today's video, I want you to sit back, I want you to relax, grab a cup of coffee or a drink, because I'm gonna be diving into the whole story. I have done a crap ton of research on this, read several books. All of those sources are going to be linked down below. But whether or not you believe these women were fake or real, we're going to get into that. I think that this is still just an absolutely fascinating story. One that carved the way for the spiritualist movement. I think it's also a very interesting study of women's rights at the time, as well as the start of so many things that we use today as psychics and mediums. And it's cool just to know where it all came from, right? And because these women were women, I think that a lot of their history was kind of like glanced over. They tried to like write it out, but there's been a lot of cool people over the years who have tried to gather all the newspaper articles, all the journals, all the books that were written, and really try to get an understanding of who these women were. But even then, there's still confusion. There's still cloudy like moments of like what was really going on. So really, I want to make this a series. I would love to just dedicate every now and then a video to exploring a different psychic out there or medium that I think that you should know about. So let me know down below if you'd like to see that. And I also want to say, if you're watching this now when it comes out, just know that approaching every Halloween season, I try to make a bunch of Halloween themed videos. About to go to the Stanley Hotel. I'm really excited about that. But subscribe if you're not already so that you can see those as they pop up. So I hope you've grabbed your drink and carved out some space to listen to this, because we're gonna set the stage for what was going on at this time. So this is America in the 1800s. So it is 1848, and it's about almost 200 years after the Salem witch trials. I do have a video on that. My husband and I actually went and traveled to Salem, so I kind of tell you the history about it there. Check that out in the card above. It was the age of industrialization in America. Science was just booming. Technologies were being created. Tons of things, like the telegraph had just been introduced. The scientific method itself was actually starting around this time, and it was really like important that everything was tested and observed and the conditions were controlled. So that was the time, like literally discoveries were being made every single day. Like this is around the time that they discovered that fossils were actually much older than they thought. Like the earth is much older than the Bible has said. So a lot of these realizations, these scientific studies were kind of like really jarring these the religious community of like, oh wow, maybe these religious leaders don't know so much of what they say they know. Now we are close to the burned over district in Rochester, New York. Sorry if I'm butchering that. And I'm reading off my notes today, so if I'm looking down, that's what you're seeing. Now the burned over district had a lot of like huge movements come out of it. We had the Quakers, we had Joseph Smith, who actually came up with like Mormonism, and there were Shakers as well. Shakers, Quakers, Joseph Smith. So it was a town that was really like liberal, very progressive, really getting into like some out there things of the time. Shakers literally believed that like spirit would come into your body and make you move and like animate you, kind of like that precursor to like speaking in tongues. This was also a hub for like abolitionists, also women's suffrage movements. Again, just setting the scene, like women could not vote at this time. Like you kind of had to rely on your husband to take care of you and take care of all of your money. If you were lucky, you could work, but most of the time women stayed home and were just kind of homemakers. Now on top of like them finding out, okay, the earth is much older than we think, starting to question a lot of the things in the Bible, you know, we also are influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg. He wrote a book that really kind of started to illustrate like, hey, maybe everyone can actually go to heaven. It's at that time like only people in the church, really prominent people, were allowed to go to heaven, which I didn't even know that was a thing. I thought this was always a thing, but he kind of approached Christianity and this idea philosophically that like, if they can go, everyone can go. And so this idea of the afterlife is a little bit more attainable to people was starting to really like seep into the culture all over the world. So essentially he introduced the idea of the afterlife to the common everyday person. Then comes the Fox sisters. We are in Hydesville, New York. They are 11 and 14. Kate is 11 years old. Maggie is 14 years old. Most of the time they're just at home hanging out with mom. They have 4 older brothers and sisters that have since left. Dad is blacksmith. I think mom is just, again, homemaker. Their day-to-day literally just consists of like helping with household chores. Now, I will say that these girls were actually pretty smart. They were educated. They had lived in both the city and in the country. However, this was not a good time for women to be women. I mean, has it ever been? But anyways, you know, they literally had in like the local like papers and journals that, you know, if your young daughter starts to show any signs of stubbornness, they should be instantly checked and resisted, that they need to have sweet and placid tempers. Anger and excitement can spoil the complexion. Hysteria at the time was also labeled a woman's disease. So just kind of setting the tone of like what it was like to be a woman back then. Now this is where it starts to get interesting, because one night the girls started to hear rapping in their home. Tiny little bedroom, tiny little home. I think it's like 2 or 3 rooms. And they're hearing knocking on the walls, they're hearing knocking on the floors. And it wasn't just the girls that heard it, their whole family did. And this was a time too where all of the family sleeps in a room together. So they all lit a candle, woke up, walked around the house trying to find the source of this noise, and they could not find it. Now these noises kept happening night after night after night, and they were trying to figure out what it was. And so they were trying to also copy the noise to figure out maybe could they figure out what it was. And one night the girls, Kate and Maggie, snapped their fingers. And when they snapped their fingers, the rapping matched their snaps. So they snapped once and the raps went once. They snapped twice, it went twice. So they're starting to realize that these raps are copying them. There's something here. There's something possibly sentient. And so Maggie wanted to figure out how to communicate with this being. So she decided to kind of create a system. She said, hey, if it's a no, give us silence. If it's a yes, rap for us, or rap twice. And that's how they started to communicate back and forth, by just purely asking yes or no questions. And so reading from her account, she asked if it was a spirit, and if it was, manifest it by 2 sounds. I heard 2 sounds as soon as the words were spoken. I then asked if it was an injured spirit to give me the sound, and I heard the rapping distinctly. I then asked if it was injured in this house, and it manifested it by the noise. I then ascertained by the same method that its remains were buried under the dwelling and how old it was. Would the spirit continue to rap if Margaret summoned the neighbors? It tapped the affirmative. So they came to find out that this spirit was a peddler. He apparently bought and sold goods and traveled and was killed in this house. And with the spirit's permission, they decided to share it with their neighbors. So over the course of the next couple of days, neighbors heard and came to their house and flocked to the house to see if they could hear the rappings. And they did. They would show up, they would sit and listen. Maggie and Kate would demonstrate these questions. The spirit would answer the questions. Now it's important to note that a lot of this was recorded right around that time in like extensive journals. They were essentially investigated like their whole entire lives, but this was the start of it. And so that's why we have such detailed accounts of what was going on in the house as early as then. And apparently these people were also described as like not easily fooled. They literally had just like mobbed and killed Joseph Smith for the crazy things that he was saying. A few days later, literally half of the city's population was gathered at the Hydesville home. they were trying to listen, they were trying to find these wraps, but apparently the spirit said he was buried under the home. So everyone was literally digging under the fox's home, trying to see if this was real or not, trying to find if there were bones. I think the first time they dug in the home, they didn't find anything. Actually, I think they were stopped by like running water underneath the home. They hit water, and so they had to stop digging. So that kind of like petered out, and they stopped digging for a while. But the girls continued to communicate with spirits, and there were more than one spirits that came through. And neighbors would come, their friends and family would hang out. They would talk to these spirits, again, asking yes or no questions. And these spirits would know things about the town. It would guess people's ages correctly. It would say how many deaths had happened in a certain family, something that like those girls might not have known. They didn't know everybody in that town. And they eventually started moving into using an alphabet, and this is where we get to precursor Ouija boards. So instead of just doing yes or no's, what they would do is they would start saying the letters of the alphabet, and whenever the correct letter was selected, they asked the spirit to rap. So they said, hey, what's your name? And they would say A, B, C, D. Wait for a knock. Okay, they knocked at D. So the first letter is D. Then they would start the alphabet right back over. A, B, C, D, E. Maybe another knock. Okay, we have D, E now. So you can see it's very slow, very precursor to some of the divination tools that we have today. And they started to ask these spirits like more existential spiritual questions, like, is there an afterlife to attain? And the spirits would answer yes. One woman even wanted to connect with her dead son, and she was like, is he still around? And the spirit said yes. There was even a cool instance where one man was like looking for a job, and the spirits told him how to like get said job and like, don't go after this one. That one's not actually going to be available. And he didn't listen, went after that job. That job was not available. And then he followed their advice for a different area to like go look, and the spirits were absolutely right. Like in a completely different town too. It wasn't just like local nearby. They were starting to discover that the spirits didn't just know about things happening now, but they also knew about things happening in the past as well as the future, which was huge. Often it was said that the spirits had an intelligence that a lot of people in the room kind of like didn't. It went above and beyond a lot of like the subject matters even that they were asking about. There was even one instance where a man was told that his son had died. And so stressed out, he went back home, and I think later that night he received a telegraph that had been written earlier that day. So again, these spirits had a knowledge of what was about to happen before anyone else would have known or could get that message to him. And that is where I'm getting like full body chills right now, but that is where like the term spiritual telegraph came from, because this man said God's telegraph has outdone Morse's altogether. And I'll say too, like, again, people were constantly walking around this home, walking in different rooms. They even split the girls into 2 different rooms, and the raps would be similar. And no one could find the source of these rappings. Even the previous owners came forward and said that they were tormented by these spirits as well. That one I don't take as seriously because they might have just been trying to get in on the fame. So going back to this house, the second time that they tried to dig, the second time that they dug, they found bones and hair and like pieces of pottery. Now, even them back then were like, oh, well, it could have been placed here. And I think somebody even suggested that the bones were that of like a pig or something. So there was a question of, you know, is this legit even back then? But one side note I want to make is that many, many years later, after the sisters had died in 1904, they actually dug up the house and moved the house to like preserve it. And when they did that, they actually did find human remains under the house. And a doctor dated them to be about 50 years old. Now, I also want to mention here too that these girls, they were young, but they were also suffering on and off from headaches. I think that's important to keep in mind because they often struggled with this throughout their life, and kind of just informs you of, hey, what are some of the things in this story that are a little bit suspicious? So at this point, these girls are young. They're 11, they're 14. They have the notoriety of, hey, everyone in the town knows of us. Locally in the papers, they were being written about. For the most part, everyone was just hearing about this through word of mouth. And so they were moving around trying to kind of like escape these spirits for a while. They moved to like different family members' houses. The wrappings would follow them. They tried to even split the girls up into 2 different homes. Still, spirits were following them. And eventually they kind of gave up on trying to escape the spirits, and they actually kind of grew fond of them. These young girls were starting to play with the spirits. And when I say play, I mean they're like conversing and talking and rapping and having fun and joking. Like they're no longer afraid of this phenomena. Apparently this also kind of turned into like poltergeist activity. They said like things were being thrown, people were being pushed. That is a little bit harder for me to believe, but I don't know. Apparently though, the spirits were getting more and more aggressive with time. They continued, no matter where they were at, to invite people over to their homes. They were not charging at this time. They were just saying, hey, come over, come witness. Neighbors, friends of friends, anyone who had heard of it would basically come over and witness things happening. This is also when they started asking spirit to move tables, which is the origination of table tipping. Apparently, they would also ask these spirits to play instruments. These instruments would play by themselves. That one, I'm like, what? How? Essentially, the first beginnings of seances were born during this time. Seance being French for session. And literally now when you hear that word, it's literally just completely taken over by the idea of spirit communication. It has turned into its own thing. And they were like exhilarating, intense experiences. Things were moving, you know, music was playing, tables were tipping. It was a fun thing that you would go do and experience that like raised your heart rate, that gave you anxiety probably, but was also just like an amazing, cool thing to witness. Everyone across the aisle would go to this, either to enjoy it and possibly receive communication from loved ones in spirit, or to like try to debunk it. Now the girls were heavily tested. Like I swear, they're like half the books that I read were about all the tests and everything that they tried to do. So they would like look and pat them down for like physical devices. They would also have like test questions. So for example, like they had like a jar of shells and somebody would just grab a handful of shells and put them in their pocket. And they would ask spirit, how many shells are in my pocket? And then they would all look and it would be the correct number. And again, the girls were hopping around, so they tested them in different homes, in different hotels. So it wasn't like something that was stuck in one spot. They were jumping around and they were still being tested, still not able to find anything. Horace Greeley, who wrote a newspaper article about them, said, whatever may be the origin or cause of the rappings, the ladies in whose presence they occur do not make them. We tested this thoroughly, and to our entire satisfaction, their conduct and bearing is as unlike that of deceivers as possible, and we think no one acquainted with them could believe them at all capable of engaging in so daring, impious, and shameful a juggle as this would be if they caused the sounds. And it is not possible that such a juggle should have been so long perpetuated in public. Soon they would have several regulars come to their sessions. Again, the word continued to spread. More and more things were recorded, put down in journals and newspapers. And this is where Leah enters. Leah was their older sister who did not live with them, who felt the urge to come and take care of them and kind of be like their manager. And she was effectively their manager. But she's the most questionable one in all of this because she was not there at the beginning, and she later claimed to be a medium and a psychic herself. Now again, most of this up until this point was just kind of like word of mouth, and people who heard something would show up to these events. And apparently the spirits started to get upset with the girls because they wanted the girls to take things public. They wanted them to tell people and tell the world of their immortality, that they existed, that there is life after death. And the girls did not oblige. They kind of said no. And when they did that, the rappings stopped. Apparently the last thing that they heard that was spelt out was, "We will now bid you all farewell." And communication literally stopped for like 2 weeks. Sisters were super sad, super depressed. They had grown used to these rappings. And then I think one session they finally said, okay, we'll do it. And apparently they heard like thunderous rapping throughout the whole house. Spirits basically being excited. And so they committed to it. And then the spirits apparently laid out a plan of, this is how you tell people about spirit communication. We want you to set up a public forum, a public hall, and tell people these things. And so they wrote all of this down from spirit, this being the sisters, but also like a few of those regulars that had, you know, kind of become big followers. They would help like write and record things down. The spirits wanted this public, and they said, you have to go and book out this theater. And it was the Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. And they put up a thing in the paper. We're going to do 4 nights, spirit communication, come experience these rappings. And it was kind of a mix of like experience spirit communication, but also teaching people how to do it. It was 25 cents per person. Doors opened at 7 p.m. So there was supposed to be like 3 or 4 nights of this forum. And on the first day, they basically were subjected to a committee. Now, these committees were there to basically see if there was any fraud. And they were trying to do these tests to figure out if these girls were lying. And so they would do these tests before the show and then also kind of during the show. And at the end of the show, the committees went up on stage and were supposed to report their findings. The first committee on I think the first or second night was basically like, we can't find anything. Audience was pissed and they fired that committee. Second committee was instructed. They did the same thing the following day. Tested, doing everything, cannot find a thing, and then reported their findings on that next night. Audience fucking pissed again. So mad. They hire a third committee. The third committee, the last one, again, cannot find any like evidence of fraud. And these tests were not like good. They were like stripping these girls down. Again, 11 and 14, they were holding their feet. They were having them step on glass to make sure that they were not creating like noises with their feet. They had like stethoscopes to hear their lungs. Like, I think by the third committee, like the girls were exhausted, and I think they were so upset and crying that the committee was like, all right, we gotta like stop. This is too much. So by that last night, the citizens were so like riled up and outrageous. Like, the girls were legitimately afraid for their lives, and they said they weren't gonna go. But they all decided that they were going to go. And that night, unfortunately, a bunch of the citizens like lit fireworks, firecrackers in the hall. The police were called, and the whole thing kind of had to like shut down. Now, this event in itself, this 3-4 day event, like, it garnered enough attention. The fact that the committees couldn't find anything, the fact that it ended in such like a uproar. These were published in newspapers, and this is when the word really started to spread about the Fox sisters. And again, their followers are publishing books about spirit communication, again, led by spirits saying, do this. So naturally, everyone is starting to learn about spirit communication and the Fox sisters and the fact that everyone can do this. It's not just them. Here's how you conduct these seances. Now, naturally, after this, the girls did not do very many like big public appearances. They kind of went back to doing just like private seances, but again, hopping around hotels, other people's homes, their homes. And this is when Leah, the older sister, started charging for those seances. Fair enough, this helped their family. These girls were not getting married, they were not going to school, not like they could anyway. They couldn't really work, and this was a way that they could support their family. People continued to come, people continued to try to figure out what was going on, if there was any sort of deception. The girls continued to have headaches. They would often go get mesmerized, which was literally a thing. It's like Dr. Mesmer, he would go and like it was like Reiki, honestly, He would Reiki people's electromagnetic fluids in their bodies to kind of fix them. So they often sought Mesmer for their headaches, but they also apparently got into like meds as well. Not like anything bad, just meds from like a doctor. And then in 1850, they decided to go on a public tour. So this is when the girls started touring with, again, their older sister Leah to hit multiple cities and kind of conduct these seances. It was usually $1 per person or $5 for a group. This is also when automatic writing or spirit writing started to become a thing. They would start to write on paper as they were receiving communication, and often the messages would be doubled. So like the words on the paper would be one message, and then the words that they're speaking, completely different message. Now, if you want to learn about automatic writing, I do have a video on that. They were at a point where they were doing 3 sessions a day, and in between those sessions, they were doing private sessions. Like, they were exhausted by the end of the day. Like me, myself, I can't even do more than like 4 readings a day. These girls were just like cranking them out. Again, always being tested by committees, held down, stripped down to like their undergarments, which was really, really risque at the time. They even had at one point like 5 men stalking them. They even had a mob show up at their house. Like, this wasn't like fun sometimes. And I think, you know, it just goes to show that like, I feel like if they really were not serious or interested or, you know, believed in what they were sharing, that they could have just been like, this is too much, screw this, I'm out of here. Now, zooming out on the bigger picture here, the Fox sisters, yes, were maybe the start, but now it started to spread to everyone else in the US as well as Europe. There were mediums popping up all over the country. Everyone was going to mediums, everyone was going to seances. Some of them charged, some of them didn't, some of them were fake, some of them I would probably argue were not. Some of them you probably would never even hear of because they just kind of did it locally, they were not famous for it. But these women were finding ways to make money, to share their mediumship abilities, and like provide entertainment for people. And I think it's interesting to note too that they were talking about like issues of the day, like diet, women's suffrage, voting, prison reform. So in a way, this was kind of a way for women to communicate about some of the larger political, societal issues at the time. Again, these women were channeling kind of out loud. They were using raps and the alphabet to communicate. There was spirit writing, and then the spirit board came into being, and that is a whole video that I've made in itself. You can check that out here. Now, going back to the frauds and the fakes, I absolutely want to acknowledge this because in every industry you will absolutely find people that are scammers, and that was absolutely the case back then. They used to have a magazine where they sold instruments that would play themselves. They would sell ectoplasm. They would even sell like literal ghosts, like sheets that you could buy to like hang up and move on wires. Now, what's interesting too is that if you got caught, if you were a fraud, a lot of times like you paid a fine and you were kicked out of town. So it was really easy for these people to just like pick up and go to another town, start all over. William Mumler is actually one of those more famous kind of like frauds because he did spirit photography where he would take pictures of people and spirits would appear. The most famous version of that being Mary Todd Lincoln. Her seeing her husband in her photo was actually the last photo taken of Mary. They actually like debunked and said that he figured out a way to like take these photos after the fact. So they were found to be fraudulent and he got in a lot of trouble. There's even a book called Hocus Pocus that taught parlor tricks. You know, up until now, like, women could not be in religious positions. Like, that was just not a thing. So this gave women a platform to speak, to talk about things, to, like, have a hand in their own spirituality. It gave them a voice, and they could kind of hide behind, like, oh, it's spirit saying this, you know, and it was, like, allowed. I truly think that the coolest part of this whole thing is that this was, like, a really, like, anti-patriarchal, like, movement. It was very like, F you to the church, like, you don't get to tell us if we get to go to heaven. You don't get to say that only men can be in these religious positions. Like, we're women, we're going to stand up and share the things that we're getting. It was this movement of individualism when it comes to like religion, and that was like not really a thing before. It was like you follow what the church says and you don't get to come up with your own new ideas. And it's like women can now be spiritual leaders. Victoria Woodhull was like one of the big people that came out of this movement. She actually was the first woman to ever run for president who was also a spiritualist. You know, at the same time, like the Seneca Falls Convention was happening, a big women's suffrage movement. And so like there's a lot of people in these realms that are also dabbling in mediumship. The abolitionist movement was also going on at this time. Like Frederick Douglass actually frequented the Fox sisters seances. So although it's not necessarily proven, like these seances, this platform for women kind of helped to share these more radical ideas around women's suffrage and abolitionism. This is also when the National Spiritualist Association was formed, which is actually still around today. I mean, there's so many cool mediums of this time that we could go into that were also part of that association. Cora L.V. Scott was one of them, and she actually channeled a lot of books written by spirit. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, actually, and I didn't know this, was part of the Spiritualist Association as well. He was the author of Sherlock Holmes. Even Charles Dickens was a spiritualist supporter. So going back to these sisters, they kept doing readings. They kept having spirits come through. Apparently Benjamin Franklin was like one of the regulars. Their financial situation is good. They're able to take care of themselves and their family. The three sisters are touring. There was one moment where some doctors like claimed that they figured it out and said that it was their toes that were making the rapping noises, and it was their toes and like their bones. I don't quite understand this, but like by snapping like their leg and their thigh bones together, they were able to make these noises. That's what they claimed. I don't quite understand like why that didn't like debunk them or derail them. My guess is that they just had enough supporters and enough of a following that that journal just kind of got lost in the noise. The sisters got older. Their lives kind of like diverged from each other. And this is when Maggie's kind of story really takes like a sad turn. She starts dating this guy and he basically wants her to stop being a medium, wants her to repent, wants her to join Catholicism. He is like leading her on and saying like, I'll be with you, I'll marry you, but if you change. So she kind of just believed him. She stopped doing readings and he sent her to like his aunt's house, basically, where she had to go to school. She was kind of trapped there, honestly, like by herself. Didn't really have contact with anybody. He wasn't there. He was off expeditioning across the world. He was actually like a really big like person who found like some cool places later on. But Maggie was completely reliant on his family's money, basically. And then Kane dies. He dies on his expedition, and this is where Maggie just kind of went into a complete like mental breakdown. She started drinking. She was desperate for money because the family was kind of running out of Kane's money, and she had no family really because she had sort of privately renounced spiritualism. The other sisters were like not hanging out with her. She, after his death, converted to Catholicism kind of out of guilt is what a lot of people is guessing, since he was constantly bugging her. So for a while she had no husband, no money. She drank heavily. She even tried to blackmail her ex-husband's family, which did not end well. And so her other sisters were embarrassed of her and they kind of kept their distance. At the time, Kate and Leah were actually like on salary for I think it was like a newspaper to do like seances on the regular. Leah also got older, got married. She found somebody to kind of take care of her financially. So she retired from doing public events. She apparently did seances like privately for the rest of her life. And a lot of people swore by, you know, her own psychic abilities, her own mediumship abilities. But now we're just left with Kate, the youngest sister, who is still doing seances. By 1861, she was 24. This is also when the Civil War started. This is when we see a huge increase in the spiritualist movement, because Lots of people are losing their loved ones in war. They're not able to say goodbye to them. They're not able to even know if they're passed away. And so a lot of people are seeking out mediums to kind of come to terms with their family members' deaths. There was actually a recorded 35,000 mediums working post-Civil War in America. And apparently this is when Kate really flourished and had some of her most biggest, like, notable things happen in her sessions. She, I think, kind of got together with a guy named Charles Livermore, who had recently lost his wife, and they had several circles where she claimed to have actual spirit apparitions, like physical spirits, bodies in the room with them. And I was like, this is so crazy. I can't even paraphrase. I'm just going to read it straight from here. Having absolutely secured the doors and windows, we sat in perfect quiet for half an hour, my faith becoming weak. This is Charles. Then we were startled by a tremendous rap on the heavy mahogany center table, which at the same time rose and fell. The door was violently shaken, the windows opened and shut. In fact, everything in the room seemed in motion. Then an illuminated substance like gauze rose from the floor behind us, moved about the room, and finally came in front of us. Vigorous electrical sounds were heard. The gauze-like substance assumed the form of a human head, covered, the covering drawn close around the neck. It was his wife, Estelle. Estelle laid her head on his. He felt his wife's long hair cascading over his face. As she moved away, a brilliant light was projecting against one of the walls. In its glow, he saw an entire female figure facing that side of the room, the light apparently in one of her hands. After remaining there fully in sight for more than half an hour, Estelle sent the message, "Now see me rise." And immediately, Livermore said, in full brightness, the figure rose to the ceiling, remained there a few moments suspended, then gently descending, disappeared. Creepy as fuck, honestly. They claimed to even be able to hold his wife's hand, to squeeze it, and feel her in that room. Honestly, around this time, there was a big question of if Kate was partaking in opium. We definitely know that she was also drinking. So this one I feel is a little bit more far-fetched. I wonder how much of it was under the influence. Now, a few years later, Kate's parents both tragically died, one right after another, and this sent her into a drinking tailspin. She had no parents. She was still trying to work to make a living. No husband at the time. She was still not in contact with Maggie. Leah had since moved away. She was trying to work for a living. And so, yeah, she began to drink heavily. Again, question of drugs. Apparently, during these sessions that she had with other people, the spirits would say, like, Kate needs help. Like, somebody needs to, like, help her. And so they packed Kate up, shipped her off to Europe to stay with some people in the Spiritualist Association. There she kind of got back on her feet. She met her husband. She actually had 2 little boys who were also like very on and off sick later in life. And she continued to do seances in England, which was actually kind of starting to really ramp off and take off there. And she really partnered up with some pretty notable people over there, both mediums as well as like physicists. So physicist and chemist William Crookes actually was somebody in England that went and tested Kate in a laboratory setting under all sorts of different circumstances to test her mediumship abilities. And some of those reports are just crazy cool. Crookes testified that Kate's versatility to give a message via automatic writing to one person, whilst a message to another person on another subject was being given alphabetically by means of raps, and the whole time she was conversing freely with a third person on a subject totally different from either. Turning back to Maggie, Maggie actually returned back to doing seances, even begrudgingly, because she later explained that she needed the money. This was 1875. She had kind of slowly repaired things with Kate. They were speaking again, and Maggie would travel back and forth between the US and Europe, and same with Kate. Kate's husband eventually died, so she packed up her 2 kiddos and moved back to the US. And now this is the part that all skeptics focus on and no mediums talk about. This This is when things really went downhill for both of the women. At the time, many mediums were writing books denouncing other mediums, calling out other fakes, including big sister Leah. Leah was writing books that were kind of like self-aggrandizing, a little bit embellished. There's a more rampant concern of like exposing fakes now, because a lot more mediums are coming out and saying other mediums are fakes. Other mediums are saying, no, I'm real and they're the fake one. And during this time, Kate and Maggie, unfortunately, were kind of like losing their credibility. People knew that they drank. There again was a question of drugs. Kate was actually charged with like child endangerment at one point, which is like a whole story in itself. But essentially they thought that Leah was the one that kind of like blackmailed them and like reported the child endangerment. And so these two sisters, they were mad, they were pissed, they were losing money, they were not making it. Seances were not happening as much, and they blamed their older sister Leah for a lot of this, and they wanted it to end. And so Maggie wrote a letter to the New York Herald called The Curse of Spiritualism, where she basically said all the mediums that are out there are fakes, and it's making it so hard for good mediums like us to be real. And the fact that she exposes some of the ways that mediums would fake this kind of, again, put a lot of question into their credibility. So after this report that she made, again, it's like the head honcho of mediums basically said, oh yeah, a lot of them are fake. And also I drink a lot because all of these things. And so like it didn't look good for her or for anyone else. And it's now 1888, 40 years since the two sisters had started to deal with spirits and rappings. And after her letter that was published, a New York Herald reporter went over to Maggie's house kind of to get an exclusive interview. And Maggie was not well. Apparently she was angry, she was pacing her apartment, again, drinking, desperate for money, and she kind of just like unloaded on this guy venting. And she said, our sister used us in her exhibitions, referring to Leah, and we made money for her. Now she turns upon us because she's the wife of a rich man, and she opposes us both wherever she can. Oh, I am after her. You can kill sometimes without using weapons, you know. And this reporter kind of flattered her and said, well, how did you do it? She told him that she wanted to keep her explanation a secret until the night that she gave her lecture, but it was all trickery. She knew for certain that spirits do not return, she said, only after trying futilely again and again to contact the dead. She was basically desperately trying to contact her husband in the afterlife. He was not coming through, and she kind of had basically given up on the whole thing. Now, I have tried to keep my opinions out of this. I'm going to say my opinion towards the end, but I do think that, you know, just given her state and the stress and the life, like where it had been at that point, like it does not surprise me that she's not connecting to spirit at all. I'll come back to make a bigger point on that later. This reporter published this in the newspaper, and it was called The Death Blow to Spiritualism. And the strangest thing is that Kate like somehow supported this and got in on it and was also like, yeah, spiritualism sucks and it's not real and we were all fake. And nobody quite knows like why she had this like sudden shift that's like just not clear. All of a sudden she's like renouncing it. Most people guess it was just kind of like to support her sister Maggie, also because she was pissed at Leah, again for possibly blackmailing and getting her arrested. So Maggie went on to demonstrate how she tricked people, again, in a big like hall. She invited a bunch of people. At the start of this event, a magician kind of opened, kind of explained how different parlor tricks worked. And Maggie got up to kind of speak to say like why spirit communication wasn't a thing. And it was a lot to kind of discredit her sister Leah. She kind of said, oh, she abused us when we were younger. She forced us to do these seances, that Leah pocketed all this money and didn't share it. And then at the end, she kind of got up on a table, hiked up her dress, exposed her feet, and showed how she made the wraps with her toes. And apparently the wrappings were heard all around the theater. And her and Kate kind of like toured for a while, again, holding these like town halls of like why spirit communication was actually not true. But one reporter kind of called out the fishiness of it all, and he said that when he spoke to Kate, who he had spoken to before, he said that she was in the hands of a professional exposer of spiritualism, that she spoke in a practiced, inauthentic manner from rote rather than from the heart. Now, here's the real kicker where I think almost everyone skips over, especially if they're a skeptic. The girls renounced their statement a year later. They actually said, no, we believe in spirit communication. What we said was not true. Maggie was visiting the founder of the Spiritualist Association and his wife. There was also, I think, 2 other witnesses in the room, and she basically said, everything that I said was untrue. She said, would to God that I could undo the injustice I did the cause of spiritualism, under the strong psychological influence of persons who were opposed to it. I gave expressions to utterances that had no foundation in fact, and that would at the time throw discredit on the spiritual phenomena. Her decision to recant, she said, was not made of her own volition, but was an impulse that came from her spirit guide. Maggie insisted that she only wanted to set the record straight. She vaguely attributed part of the blame for the original expose to powerful Catholics who had pressured her into rejecting spiritualism. She was essentially saying that she was kind of forced by the spiritualist movement's enemies and her financial position to say what she said. So essentially, Maggie flip-flopped back to the spiritualist side, back to communication. I think Leah did as well. She also said that she was not bribed to recant her position, and so that was kind of her final, say on the matter. And I think she went back to doing seances for a while, maybe not super successfully. And only 2 years later, this is when their older sister, Leah, died. In 1890, she died at her home, and she was 78 years old. Shortly thereafter, in 1891, Kate passed away from kidney disease. She unfortunately was on a drinking spree when this happened. And in 1893, penniless, Maggie died as well. She was 59 years old and died from heart failure. The Spiritualist Association buried Maggie and Kate together in the Cypress Hills Cemetery in New York. In Lilydale, New York, there's actually a memorial for the 2 sisters that you can visit. So a pretty sad ending for both Maggie and Kate. Moving past the sisters' lives and into today, by 1897, there were apparently 8 million followers of the spiritualist movement and church. However, it slowly kind of declined over the years. A lot of that was due to less people dying, less interest to communicate with loved ones on the other side. Women had more opportunities to find work outside of, just being mediums. I mean, not that every woman was a medium, but more opportunities. The Spiritualist Association is also kind of like not super fond of like organizing, labeling things. And so that was kind of like its own, I don't want to say downfall because it's still around, but that in itself kind of made it hard for the movement to kind of like grow. Physical mediumship continued to get debunked. Actually, mental mediumship was kind of differentiated from it and kind of became more popular. Some churches, like traditional churches, incorporated spiritualist thinking into their sermons and their work. It was basically like, okay, there is an afterlife, and we do still survive. And so it was more commonplace. Obviously, technology is ever on the incline. Again, scientists, people being more scrutinizing of all of these things. Medicine as well is getting better. Morphine, opium, like all of these drugs that were supposedly around at the time are more restricted. You can't get to them as easily. But it didn't completely die out. The occultism and the interest in it always was there under the surface. Madame Blavatsky was also a medium. She actually founded the Theosophical Society, and she brought together a lot of like Eastern and Western spiritual ideas that we kind of see today. She was actually cool at that time too, because she really taught that like you can control sessions with spirit. It's not so like passive, like you can decide who you're talking to, and kind of instituted some ideas that we use today as psychics. Carl Jung, who was a psychologist, also came around and started basically putting out this idea that our subconscious, our unconscious might have abilities beyond what we can imagine, that including telepathic abilities. And then World War I happens and the resurgence happens again. More people dying, more people seeking out mediums, real big uptick there. This is a really condensed history, but Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Houdini kind of battled it out for a while. You know, are mediums real? Are they not? Houdini was a magician who prided himself on debunking things. Alchemy and astrology, which had already been around for many, many years, kind of also started getting a resurgence. This is also when Edgar Cayce started popping up. Again, like I could do a whole video on him. In the 1930s, the US started actually studying parapsychology and ESP and telekinetic abilities. And then in the 1960s, we have the New Age movement. That's huge, that we're probably most familiar with now. And this really like brings in a ton of traditions, a ton of teachings from all over the world, and really establishes a very anti-religious movement. And this is when we start to hear more about psychics and mediums that we might be more familiar with. A lot of those born in that generation, like Sylvia Browne, Jane Roberts, James Van Praagh, all of these mediums came through to channel messages and kind of push this spiritualist movement forward even in their own ways. Now it's interesting because today the National Spiritualist Association says it only has like 4,000 members, but that's not necessarily indicative of like how many people believe in spirit communication. I would say like, I feel like that's way out of proportion just because being online, being a psychic, being a medium, I see hundreds and hundreds of psychics, mediums out there who are learning and growing their abilities. So I know those numbers are much higher. And I know hundreds of people seek out psychics. I would argue that now it's even more popular than before. I watched one video of somebody talking about this movement and they were talking to each other and they're like, do mediums even exist now? And I was like, yes. Oh my gosh. I would argue more so than ever. And they were like, I don't know. And I was like, well, what rock are you living under? But I'd argue with the technology that we have with the internet, ever since that, there has been such a surge of people learning about their abilities, people learning how to grow them, more mediums. I mean, I do not have numbers for this, but I feel like it's probably true because more people have access to more information. I mean, even in the last like decade or so, we've had several TV shows. Paranormal TV shows are a thing in itself. It is much more normalized in today's day and age. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean everyone accepts it, but it's definitely around. And I would argue, if it's not already like grown past the spiritualist movement, it's probably going to get there. Now, what do I believe? Were they fake or were they real? This one's a hard one to answer. And I think people probably assume that because I'm a medium, I am just like immediately on their side. But I really am not that way. You know, I was taught to be skeptical. And so when we go to this idea of, are psychics real or are they not? I think it's such a black and white question. I mean, I get it all the time. It's either you're real or you're not. You're a fraud or you're not. And there's no in between. And I think that the Fox sisters are a perfect example of everything is not black and white. I think that they started out too young to be deceptive or in on this big plan or to be really good actresses. I legitimately think that they were probably picking up on things when they were younger. And I feel like some of those earlier stories are probably true. I think that they probably connected with spirits sporadically, but towards the end, maybe not so much. I do believe that they probably started doing magic tricks and probably started doing unethical things in order to make money and keep going. I mean, I'm definitely not sold on the physical phenomena, but the fact that there are so many reports, so many that like I couldn't even get to when I was reading about this, so many journals, so many like detailed accounts of people experiencing things and not being able to explain it away. That to me is just kind of interesting. And I feel like, obviously, yes, I have a bias. I'm psychic. I believe we can connect. For a lot of these reports, it's like, how would these younger girls have known about jobs in other states? How would they have known about people that lived across town and their family members and their family members' ages? Like, yes, I'm sure there's room for, like, you know, some information to be delivered, and also like reading body language, and I do think that there's probably some of that at play, but there's a lot of information that came through that just seems well above and beyond young girls' ages to be able to figure out. You know, this was a time too where like becoming a celebrity was not just like something you did or strived for. Like, that was nearly impossible to achieve. So I really don't think that these young girls were just like, I'm gonna be a celebrity and get all this fame. Maybe Leah, maybe her, but not Maggie or Kate. But even with the physical phenomena, I have had things happen physically that I cannot explain. And, you know, it makes me wonder if that we're so skeptical to it. We so don't believe that it will happen that we've kind of said, oh, I'm not even open to it. I'm not going to witness it. I'm not going to see it. And therefore, that's maybe why physical phenomenon doesn't happen now. Or maybe it's too hard for spirits. You know, I'm really open to learning more about that. I've actually tried to find like physical mediumship courses, and they are so, like, I found one in England, and I was like, okay, that's really difficult for me to get to. So with stuff like this, I'm always willing for something to change my mind either way. But that one is just, it's so interesting to me that back then it was all physical, and nowadays it's not, and it's mental. And it's like, what's changed? Is it the mediums? Is it the spirits? You know, it's such an, that part gets me every time, you know. Or like, honestly, maybe fairly enough, maybe people were dumber back then. maybe we're just very like critical nowadays. I don't know. Now, were they probably tempted by money and fame? Absolutely. But at the same time, these were women who only could make money from their husbands. So it's like they had to survive in some sense of the word. And I think back then nobody was teaching about the ethics of spiritual communication, right? Like, now we do. Now we have all of these things that we say, don't do this, don't do that, you know. But back then they were literally founding spiritual communication. And so I think that it was natural for a lot of them to go down roads and push those, you know, boundaries, and not really know if that's a bad thing or a good thing. You know, and the headaches and the drugs and the drinking is interesting to me because, one, I talk about how, you know, when you do those things, it can kind of lower your boundaries and make it easier for you to connect. But at the same time, I know that some drugs and like opium, you know, that's going to cause your mind to be altered in a way that, like, you know, are you really seeing spirits? Is that actually happening, or is that the drugs? But at the same time, I do think that this is why Maggie probably stopped experiencing things. It's like, she's drinking, she's not taking care of herself, she's not a clean and clear vessel, she's desperately trying to connect, a lot of emotions involved, which we talk about. You kind of have to be a clean, neutral slate when you do readings. And so she's not connecting, and so she is now believing, oh, no communication, no spirits, when in fact no one was around to probably say, oh, well, you know, you got to take care of yourself and your mental health in order to do this work. When it comes to their denouncing of the whole thing, I do think that they wrapped their toes. I do think that they contributed to that. But I think what's more important here is that they took it back a year later. And that's the part that people always leave out. And I think when you look at those accounts and them saying, nope, I was pushed by somebody else, I was financially in a bad spot, and you look at the context of what was going on in their lives, it's like, okay, I can see why they would do that. And when they stuck to it and stuck to, yeah, spirits are real, even towards their dying days, like, I think that says a lot about what they believed. You know, and that's another thing. They did this for 40 years. 40 years, and they were never caught in any sort of like outright deception like some of the other mediums did, like, you know, like, oh, literal sheets on a string, or people pulling the tables with stuff. Like, they were never caught in that, and they were tested so many times. And I think there's a lot of credibility in that alone. So are they real? Are they fake? It's like, There's so much in between there. You know, I really think that you can be a medium, but you can also be unethical. I think you can connect, and then other times you could be using magic tricks. And again, it goes back to this question that we always ask about psychics, like, are they real or are they not? There's only two answers to this, and I think it's one of the hardest things I come across as a psychic, because everyone expects you to be perfect. Everyone expects you to be right 100% of the time, and everyone forgets that you are still human. And I speak about this in a podcast that I recently put up, and I will link that down below. In summation, I find these women honestly to be pretty inspirational. I think that they really stuck by what they said, and they went through a lot of tests, a lot of really like not cool tests, standing on glass, being stripped down. These women were violated and they still stuck to their beliefs. I think that they had good intentions at first. I think they were communicating with spirit at first, but then they got tempted and they got into unethical practices because they felt like they needed to keep up the performance when maybe they couldn't do it anymore. And I think that that's totally understandable with mediums that maybe just did not know how to do it yet. Honestly, I'm stealing a quote from one of the books that I read because I think it describes it so perfectly. But it says that these girls were so daring that it points either to the strength of their ambition or to the courage of their conviction. And I mean, I think I totally relate to that, because like, I do this work and I really passionately believe in it. And I come up against so many people that want to push back and want to like hurt and harm and say awful things about it. And it can absolutely be grueling, and it can be like so demotivating. And some days I just want to quit, honestly, because it's like, what is the point? But when I see people sticking to their guns in that way, the Fox sisters, you know, it just gives me inspiration to do the same. You know, even if they didn't have the best intentions, even if they did fake it towards the end, you know, I think that we have a lot to thank of these sisters, because mediums are now a normalized thing. Like, yes, psychics in some form, like prophets, existed, spirit communication existed prior to them, but they really made it normalized, especially for women, to speak about spiritual manners in the US and in Europe. And then it spread everywhere. And if it weren't for them doing that work for so long, I don't think it would have spread as widely or as passionately as it did. You know, seances became a thing, spirit boards, spirit writing, all these tools we use today as mediums really originated from this movement that these sisters started. So even if they weren't honest all the time, and even if they did fake a lot of things, I think they made some huge achievements and leaps in history. Now, am I encouraging psychics to be unethical? Absolutely not. We know better nowadays. Please do not take that as what I'm saying. We should not be copying their example. However, I think that given the circumstance, given the time, I think it's a pretty huge accomplishment what these two sisters did. But I want to know, what do you think? What do you think about the sisters and this story? Has your opinions changed? Have they not? Please let me know if you'd like to see more of them. I think that they would be fun to do every now and then. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like. Also, let me know what you think in the comments down below, and I will see you in my next one. Alrighty, bye.